These select boxes on timeline page are used to select specific activity for every hour, and every hour in our application is represented by timeline item object. But whenever we select value by using this select box, we are not modifying any properties of that timeline item object, but instead separate local variable called selectedActivityID within timeline item component gets modified and assigned a value of the selected activity. And now we're going to add one more property to timeline item objects that are stored within timeline items array of the app component to store ID of specific activity selected by using those select boxes. And this way we will connect selected activity to every hour. So let's start with adding one more property to timeline item objects. We generate timeline items array by using generate timeline items function. And right here for now we have only one property hour. We're going to add another property called activity ID with initial value of null. And then just to connect this value to those select boxes on timeline page, we need to pass value of this property activity ID within selected prop of base select component. And this way we make those select boxes be dependent on selected activity property of every timeline item object. And now that local variable which was used to store selected value of this select box is no longer needed, we can remove it. And what we see right now in Vue DevTools is that every object within timeline items array has additional property activity ID with an initial value of null. And we already know that those objects will get passed to every timeline item component as timeline item prop. And the next step would be to update activity ID property with selected activity ID whenever user chooses particular activity by using this select box. And to do that, we will need to modify handler of select event, which comes from base select component. We're going to use separate function with the name select activity. So after this event is received, it will get passed ID of selected activity. Within this handler, we're going to receive ID of selected activity, which comes from base select component, and then we'll notify parent component by sending custom event with the name select activity. And to let parent component know which activity was chosen, we will need to find activity in here by using ID and pass it along with this event. And before proceeding further, let's declare macro define emits. In here we'll add one custom event select activity, and validation function for this event will be isActivityValid. Then let's scroll up and import all necessary functions, and remove import of ref function. And now let's determine how we will search for activity objects by using ID. Let's assume that in this component we have access to array of activities. Then we can use native array method find to find particular object of this array. So this method allows us to search for elements by particular condition. And since we're searching for activities by their IDs, we're going to compare ID of current activity with that ID we received as a parameter to this function. But of course, currently we don't have access to activities array from within this component, so we need to accept it from outside. Let's declare one more prop with the name activities. This property is going to be required. Type will be array, and validation function will be validate activities. And as always, let's scroll up and import all necessary functions. And also let's format this import a little bit by placing every imported function on its own line for better readability. And as a next step, we're gonna have to pass that activities array declared in the root component within timeline item component. So first of all, from the app component, we're going to pass this array to the timeline component as activities prop. Within the timeline component, we also have to declare this prop. Let's copy over declaration of this prop from timeline item component and move it to the timeline component. In here, we also have to import validate activities function. Let's do so right here. And finally, by having access to this array within the timeline component, we can easily pass this array further to every timeline item component as activities prop. And after doing all that, let's see what we got in Vue Developer Tools. So in the root component, we have activities array. It is the component where this array was initially declared. And then we're passing this array as activities prop to the timeline component. And after that, every timeline item component will also receive this array as activities prop. So right now, after choosing value in this select box, we will be able to find activity by its ID, since now we have access to activities array from within timeline item component. And then we're going to fire custom events back to app component so that this app component can properly update timeline item object with the activity ID that was just chosen for that particular hour. And in terms of code, it's gonna look like this. After choosing value in that select box, firstly the select activity handler gets called, where we're going to find the activity object by the received ID, and then this whole activity object gets passed to parent component along with select activity event. But here we need to reference activities array by using props object, since activities is one of the props in this component. And after this event is received by this component, we're gonna have to send another custom event. For example, we'll call this event set timeline item activity. And this way we're gonna let root component know which activity should be assigned to a particular hour. That hour is represented by timeline item object, so we're gonna pass this object as a payload, as well as object of currently selected activity in that select box. And that object is received in this handler as event payload within special event variable. And before registering handler for this event in parent component, first of all, let's just use define emits macro to declare all necessary custom events. We have only one event with the name set timeline item activity, which is going to receive object with two properties, timeline item and activity. We're gonna destructure these properties in here and write validation for every property. So checking if timeline item object is valid, we're going to by using isTimelineItemValid function. And as for activity object, we'll check it by using another validation function called isActivityValid. And as we can see, it's pretty convenient to initially declare all necessary validation function and then reuse them whenever we need to. And finally, to verify that both of these functions will return true, we're gonna wrap these calls in array and call method every on this array, passing boolean constructor. And finally, let's go inside of parent component, which is root component app. And here we're going to declare listener for set timeline item activity event. And to handle this event, let's use separate function with the same name, set timeline item activity. And all this function will have to do is to assign activity ID to activity ID prop of timeline item object. So let's destructure two properties that we receive from child component, timeline item and activity object. And then let's write statement which will assign activity ID to activity ID property of timeline item object. And that's it. This is how we assign particular activity to every hour. Before checking this out in a browser, let's go back to the timeline component and import all necessary validation functions, such as isTimelineItemValid and isActivityValid. We also need to store all defined properties within timeline item component in props constant, since we use this constant in this component. And now let's see what happens when we will select value in this select box. Let's watch timeline item object and specifically activity ID property. And just like that, this property gets updated and assigned selected activity ID. And of course, since we do modification of this property within app component, first timeline item object in timeline items array of parent component was also modified. Because technically this is the same object, which then gets passed to all necessary components down the component tree. Firstly, this array of timeline items objects gets passed to the timeline component, and then every object from this array gets passed to individual timeline item components as timeline item prop. And of course, all those select boxes on this page are completely independent from each other. And if we're gonna select activity by using second select box, then it will affect second timeline item object from timeline items array, and selected activity ID will be assigned to activity ID property of the second object, as we can see right here. And the reason why we had to do this modification of timeline item object by assigning selected activity ID to activity ID property directly in root component instead of, for example, in the timeline component is because timeline items array is declared within root component. And doing data modifications that get passed to other components as prop directly in those components is not a good practice. So that's why we had to fire custom events all the way back to root component so it could properly update this array. So right now there is only one problem, which happens when we try to reset value of this select box. And we can see that the error message related to this problem pops up in the console. We're going to fix this problem in the next lesson.